Hello. It works.
You're it. You're it. You're it, Camo. You're it, Camo. Oh, no.
This third cranial nerve that goes through the eye right through here, it's had some impingement where it's pinched a little bit, swollen. He's had some loss of function here for a little while, and they're gonna do some more tests to kind of figure out what's going on exactly. He's better in some ways, but he's still double vision and blurred and stuff, and it's affected one of his eyes on one side. But they're again, like Charlie, they ruled out some things that might have been even more involved, but they're not through with all their tests right now. But he isn't home.
Mildred Lemoyne, did she get out?
She should be, she should have been home this afternoon.
She's gonna go home this afternoon.
To a missing legend for rehab.
Janice Ingram's in the hospital with COVID. And Wayne Thompson was to see the doctor in Houston today.
Yeah,
about
she
his eye.
said they put a prism on his eye. I don't really know what problem he's having on his eye. He's not happy, but she was.
Well, she's happy, that's all that matters. The youth retreat leaves Sunday. Be in prayer for that. Of course, Betty Garrett, Connie Atkins, still in prayers. Give me the Bible collections is going. So far, we've collected 5540.
That's roughly 700 Bibles, I believe.
And
Give a guess.
yeah, for $8 piece. 766.
Pretty awesome Bible.
That's right. That's real nice. And we need volunteers for the community preparation for 2021. January already taken, but we need volunteers for the rest of the year. There's sign up sheet in the back. Still needing teachers for the coming year, sign up sheet for both Sunday and Wednesday back. On the table on the back. Now, I believe that's it. JD's gonna have a song. And Jeff got an opening prayer. Jimmy, I guess that's right. Sounds good.
We're just doing one song again, so y'all ready, like the invitation song, we'll do number 667, Power in the Blood, and then invitation song. 667. Then turn over to 717, we'll sing
Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for these times we have to come together to have fellowship with one another, to open your word and share together, Father, and learn of your will for us. And Father, we are just thankful that you love us and you care for us, and you sent your Son Jesus to this earth to live here and to give his life for us. But mostly, Father, we're so grateful that you demonstrated your power by raising him to life again. And therefore, we have the hope of life eternal with you. Father, know that many are sick, been mentioned already, and many more. And we just ask that you bless each one. See to their needs, bring them back to the health that they desire. That's our prayer. Father, there have been many on the roads this weekend and next, traveling, seeing families, visiting. Father, help us to keep us safe. Help us never forget that your Son coming to this world is the reason for this season. Whether it's this day or another, not really important. We celebrate the gift that you gave this world, sending your Son. We just ask that you use this time to touch the hearts of people throughout this world. Help us to be a light, to shine the light of Jesus to the lost in this world. Just go with us, Father, be with Jimmy as he brings the lesson to us tonight. Help us to love you more each day, to love each other more. Help us to live our lives for Jesus every day. It's in his name we pray.
Hey, we'll take all the kids, if y'all are okay. You see, you okay with it?
Well, we're kind of few in number, but not let that hinder us tonight. We're going to study for a few minutes together in Galatians chapter 2. Galatians chapter 2. You remember, without spending too much time in review, that we're in the context of Paul proving, illustrating, giving evidence for the fact that he is indeed a true apostle, and that he has been given the message he preached, the gospel, directly by revelation from God rather than by some form of education. And of course, the reason that he's proving that, or the reason that he's evidencing that, or trying to provide evidence, is because the accusations are being made by the false teachers, the Judaizing teachers in the churches of Galatia, that Paul isn't really an apostle. That he may be a lot of things, but he's not on par with the original 12 apostles. And the reason that they bring that up isn't necessarily to disrespect Paul, it's to call his preaching into question. It's to help the Christians wonder whether, be concerned about whether or not Paul really knows what he's talking about. So in an effort to eliminate that accusation, Paul goes through a pretty lengthy list, several different events that occurred, as well as rehearsing his own conversion, that give us assurance and confidence that he really is an apostle, that he really has been sent by God, that he really did receive his message by inspiration, and therefore, unlike what the false teachers, the Judaizers, are teaching, the gospel of Christ by faith through grace is sufficient, and in fact, any other gospel isn't really good news at all. It isn't a gospel. Now, let me begin again just to emphasize the importance of this. There's more than history involved in the book of Galatians, as is true of all the New Testament. We can learn history, we can learn some events that happen, but the point for us is that there's nothing more dangerous. There is no doctrine that's ever been taught that perverted the gospel any more deeply than emphasizing a message that supplements the gospel, the good news of Jesus, with anything. The gospel plus anything else, whether it's circumcision or any other form of works, is a condemning message rather than a saving message. It isn't the gospel. You see, the message that these Judaizers came to Galatia with was that what Paul's taught you so far as it went has been pretty good. But what he didn't tell you is that in order to truly be a Christian, you have to be a Jew too. You have to be circumcised as well. You have to continue keeping some of the traditions of the Jewish forefathers. And Paul deals very bluntly, very plainly, straightforwardly with that doctrine, because it's not a matter of opinion. It's not a matter of expediency. It's a matter of being saved or being lost. It's a matter of salvation. So as we have looked at and continue looking at a series of events that Paul writes about to these Christians, and fortunately for us too, a series of events that prove to us, or at least it should, that he really is who he claims to be. The gospel he preaches is the full gospel directly by revelation from God, and that anyone that teaches some other gospel, well, as he said back in chapter 1, is to be anathema or recognized as cursed by God. Now, one of the events that Paul mentions that illustrates his genuineness, his authority, the purity of his message, is a confrontation between he and Peter. Now, I don't know if confrontation is exactly the right word, but a disagreement that arose over Peter's behavior in a certain situation. As Peter had traveled to Antioch, which is the place where Jewish believers were first called Christians, where believers, period, were first called Christians. Antioch becomes the church from which, the hub from which all of Paul's missionary travels originate, well, along with Timothy and Silas and Barnabas and others of his companions. Peter travels after the Jerusalem conference, after the vision concerning Cornelius and his household, after his defending the fact on at least 2 occasions that the Gentiles are accepted under exactly the same terms before God as a Jew. And God proved that by what event? How did God prove, at least in Peter's mind, that he had decisively answered the question of how a Gentile can be saved? What evidence did he provide? What proved it to him? Well, the vision obviously opened his eyes to a lot of things, but what was it that really proved it to him? And he quotes it. He refers to it in Acts 15 when he talks to the church leaders and the apostles at the Jerusalem conference. What was the event that proved beyond any reasonable doubt that in spite of what the Jews may have thought, God has dealt with the Gentiles? Well, the vision, and that began the process, but when God poured out his Spirit on the Gentiles, you remember, at Cornelius' household, he referred back to that even in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15. He said, when I saw God pour out on the Gentiles the same Spirit that he did upon us in Acts chapter 2 in Jerusalem, then I knew God was proving, okay? God was proving that he accepted Gentiles on the same terms that he did Jews. That was the foolproof evidence. There were a lot of them that I'm sure testified to that, but that was the ironclad proof. Now, Peter comes to Antioch, and when he gets to Antioch, which is obviously primarily a congregation of Gentiles, Peter's a Jew. He comes to Antioch, and he recognizes the fact that there's nothing wrong with a Jew sitting down to eat with a Gentile brother or sister. And even the food that might be served in a Gentile home is absolutely clean. And how does he know that? Because God told him that in that vision, didn't he, Frank? What I've cleansed, you don't call unclean. We know God was ultimately talking about the Gentile people. But he used the illustration of the food that he told Peter to take and eat, and Peter refused. You remember it 3 times. God said, Peter, what I've cleansed, you don't call unclean. You don't call unclean. Peter recognized that. He ate, associated with, extended the right hand of fellowship to his Gentile brethren so long as the group from Jerusalem didn't show up, right? And when the group from Jerusalem shows up, what happens? How does Peter react? He goes right back. That's exactly right. When Peter, verse 11 of chapter 2, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood to be condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began drawing back and separating himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision party. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their example of hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. Why is what Peter did? I'm not talking about his motive. I'm asking, why is how Peter handled himself in that situation, why is it a big enough issue that it called for Paul to confront him about it? I mean, well, why does it matter? Why does it matter? Well, y'all know the answer. I'm sorry?
He gives credence to their teaching.
That's exactly right. He supports the whole Judaizing teacher doctrine. Obviously he doesn't intend for that to be. He doesn't intend for that, but his behavior goes right back to the things, as you say, Frank, that he had been taught out of, that he knew better than. And again, let me say to you, as I did last week, this to me is a perfect illustration of the fact that just because we know something doesn't mean we're going to be effective at actually doing it, right? We know a lot of things that sometimes we fail utterly at being able to do. And I'm not throwing Peter under the bus. I've told you, I'm glad Peter's life is part of the story of the New Testament because it gives me a little bit of inspiration and hope. Because I find myself very much like Peter. I do a lot of things that I know better than doing, right? No better than doing. And yet here Peter is doing that. It's a big deal because this issue of Jew and Gentile, you remember our discussion when we talked about the Jerusalem conference in the opening verses of chapter 2? That the discussion about the decision concerning whether Jews or whether Gentiles rather have to become Jews. And I say it that way because to be circumcised meant to become a Jew, okay? That's what that meant. That's what they were demanding. That in order for a Gentile to become a Christian, they first had to be circumcised is a doctrine that undermines the sufficiency of the sacrifice of Christ. That's why Paul would say further on in our study that if you can be justified by works, by law, by any human performance, then you have no need of Christ. Christ is of no value to you. That's why this is such a big issue. That's why this is so important. Now, the reason Paul feels compelled to confront Peter about this digression, the discrepancy between what he knows and what he does, is because, well, it's illustrated when we find at the last of that reading, 2 things happen. I mean, in addition to Peter himself digressing to a position that he knew better than doing, what did his actions, what effect did they have on other people? All the Jews followed suit. Even old Barnabas. Even Barnabas. You see, that's I'm not going to say the more dangerous thing about legalism, but it's a very dangerous thing about legalism, is because it tends not just to affect the one person involved, it tends to intimidate other people into cooperating or going along with it, doesn't it? I mean, don't we see that? We're not talking about circumcision or Jews and Gentiles, but even today, aren't legalistic doctrines enforced by intimidation? Sure they are. You're going to be written off. You're going to be written off if you don't subscribe to that philosophy, if you don't follow suit.
Used to be anybody had a duplicated machine could write up others.
That's right.
Send letters to certain people all around.
That's right. Pens and letters and notes have been really destructive at times. Really destructive at times. Tools of intimidation. And that's exactly what Peter's actions do. I don't suggest that Peter intended to do that. I'm just saying that's what happened. That's what happened. Okay. Now let's talk for a few minutes about some other things that we learn, because this is a really interesting encounter to me for a lot of reasons. One of them is that it goes back to, Johnny, something that you said a moment ago to me, is the way we deal with each other. That there's a lot to learn from this encounter about how we deal with each other. Number one, I'll state the obvious, that Paul wasn't prepared to ignore the fact that Peter was doing something wrong, and that his wrongdoing had implications of affecting other people. He wasn't willing to say, okay, we'll just ignore it and move on or pretend it never happened. He couldn't do that. He couldn't do that because it's too big an issue. But when he decided to confront Peter, some of my brethren would have probably stood up in the public environment that they were in, somebody's house eating or whatever was going, wherever they were, where everybody was there, and stood up and loudly defamed Peter in front of everybody. Discredit him. Discredit him. Does Paul do that? No, he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. He's not looking to embarrass Peter. He's not looking to blacklist him. He's not looking to have him written off. He's looking for him to correct the wrong. That's what he wants to see happen, and that's what he has confidence is going to happen. Because he goes to Peter privately, and you know what? It also says a lot about Peter's attitude too, doesn't it? Peter could have been, as we said last week, very quick to say, wait a minute. Nobody questions my authority as an apostle, and everybody questions yours, so who do you think you are talking to me like that? Yeah, that could have happened, right? Human nature could make that easy to see how that could have happened, but it didn't happen. It didn't happen. The result of the confrontation was that Peter changed. He corrected what had been wrong. Now, without getting into all the specifics and the details or getting down into the dirt in this discussion, let me just point out to you that Paul didn't talk to everybody else about Peter's problem. He talked to Peter about Peter's problem. That's a pretty big deal. That's a pretty big deal. I just know human nature, myself included, that we find it a lot easier to talk to somebody else about so-and-so's problem than we do to talking to so-and-so, don't we? A lot easier. This is a pretty good example of how that oughtn't happen. That shouldn't happen, and it doesn't happen. I don't know who all became aware, but that wasn't the point, that wasn't the intention, and it's very likely that not very many people initially were aware of the fact that Paul went to Peter and told him that you're acting in a way that's inconsistent with what I know you believe. And that's the gist of what he told him. He uses several different doctrinal points to make that point, but his point is, Peter, you're acting in a way that undermines the very message that I know you've accepted and that you believe and that you're preaching. You're doing the very thing you said we should never do. And I suppose that Peter probably, well, there's no use conjecturing. All I can tell you is the result was it changed. It changed. And Peter didn't have to be destroyed in order for it to change. Everybody grew as a result of it. Now, the reason Paul brings this up isn't, again, so that he makes Peter look bad. It's so that these Galatian believers could understand, these Judaizing teachers that are telling you that my message isn't true, it isn't pure, it isn't divinely given, it isn't revealed by God, that I'm not really an apostle, then you explain to me how Peter, who had already extended the right hand of fellowship to me in Acts 15 in Jerusalem at the Jerusalem conference, you tell me why Peter allowed me, his brother, to confront him over an issue that could have been very embarrassing if he didn't recognize the fact that I am an apostle just like he is. I'm a Christian just like he is. There's no rank, right? No rank. Okay, any comment, thought? I've done 99% of the talking. Any comment? You see something about this encounter other than what we talked about that's a powerful lesson to you? Absolutely right. Absolutely right. I moved to a place one time, Johnny, and I was a very young preacher, very early in my ministry. I moved to a place, and within a week, I got a letter in the mail. And it was to the preacher. It wasn't even addressed to me personally, just whoever the preacher was going to be. Okay? I opened the letter, and it was a 13-page questionnaire. And when I saw the young man's name who signed the back of it, asking or requesting or really kind of demanding that you fill out this questionnaire, the point was, I'm going to see whether you measure up to be regarded as a faithful brother or not. And that's what it was. It was a test for that purpose. I didn't fill it out. That helps you feel it. Then I threw it in the trash. But all that aside, people are still people. People are still people. Jeff, or was it Tony? You was going to say something.
Very sobering to think about. Peter had that moment of weakness, and he was able to pull that off. I mean, in front of Paul and the other apostles. It's very humbling because the spirit is strong, but the body is weak.
Mm-hmm.
And Peter can do that. We need to take notice because
Absolutely. And even compound that by the fact that Peter has been here before, not over circumcision, but he's said things and not been able to do them before, right? This isn't the first time. And I'm not throwing him under the bus. I'm just saying that's a good point. That's a good point, that the spirit is in fact much stronger than the flesh that's weak. The difference between us knowing the good we ought to do and actually doing the good we ought to do, sometimes there's a wide gap. And growing mature is the narrowing of that gap. The narrowing of that gap. Jeff, sit on your face.
This has nothing to do, has a little bit to do with, but not really anything directly to do. There is a certain religious organization that has, at least certain people in that organization has stated that, yeah, Paul confronted Peter, but Peter actually won the argument.
Yeah.
And as a result, they tend not to teach Paul's teachings out of the New Testament.
That's right.
And they tend to be very law-keeping, rule-keeping people.
Yes.
And
Well, you would almost have to reject the whole New Testament, especially the epistles of the New Testament, in order to believe that, because Paul's whole point, everything he has said up to this point in the book of Galatians, and by the way, everything he's going to say for the rest of it as well, points out the fact that if rule keeping could save us, then we don't need, let's just drop this Christianity thing. If rule keeping can save us, then let's just try hard. Just try hard. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps.
Preachers would go to be bookkeepers.
That's exactly right. Exactly right.
You'd have to get so many.
And you talk about a fight.
You have to set a number saying, okay, you've got to do this many good deeds to get to heaven. And, just people would be people, they legislate it back and forth.
Can you imagine?
And what a good thing is and what a bad thing is. And, that's essentially what the Pharisees had done.
That's right.
In the Old Testament.
That's right.
They had built laws on top of
That's right.
out thin air.
You think the Democrat and the Republican fight's a mess. You put a bunch of Christians together trying to decide whose rules apply, and man alive, we'll eat each other up.
There have been wars over religion.
history of the church has seen that very thing happen, haven't we? Haven't we?
No, the history of the Christian religion has
Yes.
been that.
Yes.
History of the church is
Yes. I have to agree. Yeah, we'll leave it right there. I agree with you. Well, again, let's bear in mind that while we could really dig down on the historical facts surrounding this whole situation, the point is Christ and salvation by faith through God's grace is the only message that's gospel. That's the only message that's gospel. And you don't plus that with anything. Any plus to that results in a condemning message rather than a gospel, okay? Rather than the gospel. It sounds good, and it's sometimes appealing to people, but it's a condemning, dangerous message. Dangerous thing. Okay, any other thought? Any other thought? We didn't get a lot further, but we got to something that I really felt like was important out of this text, and that is how Paul and Peter reacted to and respected each other and dealt with each other. And it teaches us a lot about our relationships to our brothers and sisters, even when there's a disagreement or there's a confrontation that needs to take place in order to defend what's true. It's not a fight. It's not a brawl. It's not somebody being stepped on, somebody being discredited, somebody being blacklisted. If that's true, then our motives are wrong. Our motives are wrong. Okay, anything else? Well, let's mark. I don't mark it at all. We know where we are. You know where we are. We'll pick up with that again next time. Obviously this is a really interesting time of year, and the fact that it's happening in combination with the COVID and all the other things has really made it an interesting dynamic this year, hasn't it? A lot of things going on that, you could wish that we weren't having to deal with, but we do. One of the messages or one of the things that we need to come away with constantly, irrespective of the COVID virus or anything else, is the fact that we have inherited the opportunity to be saved, not because we earn it, deserve it, or are worthy of it, but because God loves us. It's that simple. It's that plain. And that in response to the love of God, all we can do is, as Paul says in Romans 12, present our bodies as a living sacrifice, as a life offered on the sacrifice of serving, on the altar of serving God. One of the messages of this time of year, when we're with our families or we're doing whatever it is that we do, one of the things I hope that takes priority is us recognizing the fact that the greatest gift, the greatest opportunity, the greatest good that's ever been offered is available to all men, and yet it seems so difficult to convince all men of the value of that gift, of the significance of that gift. And the reason is because we first have to accept the fact that I can't do it. And we proud humans have a hard time with that, don't we? We have a hard time thinking I can't do it, or I am not strong enough or wise enough or whatever it is enough. And yet that's where the relationship with God begins, is understanding that. If you have a need tonight, whatever it might be, just to ask for prayers and for encouragement or for anything else that we can be of help to you, please give us the opportunity to play that role and to be of help to you as we stand together and sing together tonight.
Working
be here tonight, and those that might be viewing this over the television. Let's be dismissed in prayer. Father in heaven, we really come to you, thanking you for blessing us the way you do. We know that this world has a lot of things to draw us away from you or preoccupy us with, but we thank you for time that we can come back together to study, think, and meditate on your word and apply it to our lives. Pray that we've done so tonight. It's been a blessing to all those that have been here. Father, we do pray for our sick. We've had some that we are quite concerned about, for Eddie Milam, for Charlie Reader, for Little Moyne, for Wayne Thompson, and others that are recovering. Even Miller and those recovering from surgeries and different procedures. We thank you for the improvement of several of them. We have continued improvement for the others. We have a lot of teen family who have had loved ones that have passed away. Precious Linda's gone, and we have a hard time even conceiving that. But we thank you that she's with you now. And we pray for all those other families who will be going through this first Christmas time and holiday season without their loved ones, because it's the first time. It's hard.